The decisive naval battle of 1905, Russia versus Japan. Picture this, it's 1905, and the world's attention is fixed on a small strip of water between Korea and Japan. Two massive fleets face each other in what would become one of history's most decisive naval battles. On one side stands the Russian Baltic Fleet, representing the might of the largest nation on Earth. On the other, a navy that didn't even exist 30 years ago, from a country many Westerners still viewed as a mysterious land of samurai and geishas. What happened next would shake the foundations of global power and change the course of history forever. The year is 1904, and Russia, one of the world's mightiest empires, is about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating its opponents. The streets of St. Petersburg buzz with confidence. After all, how could a small Asian nation possibly challenge the Russian bear? The Tsar's ministers laugh at intelligence reports warning of Japan's military buildup. "Those little yellow monkeys," one Russian minister reportedly sneered. "They don't have a chance." But while Russia dismissed Japan's potential, America watched with keen interest. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who would later play a crucial role in this conflict, had already recognized something that Russia failed to see. Japan was no longer the isolated kingdom of old. In just 50 years, it had transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial power. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if the America of George Washington's time had suddenly fast-forwarded to the age of steam engines and battleships. That's essentially what Japan accomplished. By 1904, Japanese warships, built in British shipyards to the latest specifications, were among the most advanced in the world. Their crews trained relentlessly, day and night, in all weather conditions. They weren't just preparing for a war, they were preparing for this specific war. The spark that lit this powder keg? Control over Korea and Manchuria. Russia, expanding eastward, saw these territories as its natural sphere of influence. Japan, emerging from centuries of isolation, saw them as essential to its security and economic future. When diplomatic negotiations failed, Japan made a decision that left the world gasping. They would strike first. On February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats slipped through the darkness toward the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. The Russian sailors, celebrating a birthday party for an admiral's wife, never saw them coming. By morning, two of Russia's most powerful battleships lay crippled in the harbor. The audacity of this attack sent shockwaves through the Western world. The New York Times' headline screamed, "Japan strikes first blow." American public opinion, initially divided, began to shift. Here was David taking on Goliath, and Americans love an underdog. But this was just the opening act. The real test would come when Russia sent its Baltic Fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron, on an epic 8-month journey around the world to confront the Japanese Navy. Led by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, this voyage would become one of the most extraordinary and disaster-prone military expeditions in naval history. Imagine setting sail with a fleet that seemed cursed from the start. Off the coast of Denmark, Russian ships opened fire on British fishing boats, somehow mistaking them for Japanese torpedo boats. In the North Sea, thousands of miles from Japan. The Hull incident, as it became known, nearly brought Britain into the war against Russia. Then came the long journey around Africa, through the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. Ships broke down, crews mutinied, coal was scarce, and friendly ports were scarcer. By the time they reached the Far East, Rozhestvensky's men were exhausted, demoralized, and about to face an enemy they had grossly underestimated. Meanwhile, Japanese Admiral Heihachiro Togo, nicknamed the Nelson of the East by Western observers, waited patiently. His fleet's crews had spent months drilling and preparing. They knew these waters. They had studied Russian naval tactics. And they had something else, a desperate determination to protect their homeland from what they saw as Western imperialism. As Rozhestvensky's fleet approached the Tsushima Strait, the narrow waters between Korea and Japan, Togo received the message he had been waiting for. Enemy fleet sighted in Square 203. The date was May 27, 1905. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in history, a battle that would prove to the world that the age of Western military dominance was coming to an end. The morning of May 27, 1905, dawned with a thick fog blanketing the Tsushima Strait. In the Russian fleet, sailors nervously scanned the mist for any sign of the enemy. They had come so far, but something felt wrong. The sea was too quiet, the fog too thick. Admiral Rozhestvensky, suffering from a severe headache in his flagship's cabin, couldn't shake the feeling that they were sailing into a trap. He was right. Hidden in the fog, Japanese scout ships tracked the Russian fleet's every move, maintaining complete radio silence. Admiral Togo's main fleet waited patiently, like a coiled spring. Then, at 1:45 p.m., the fog suddenly lifted, revealing a sight that made Russian sailors' hearts sink. The entire Japanese battle fleet, their ships' crews already at battle stations, their guns pre-ranged for the exact spot where the Russians now found themselves. Togo's flagship, the Mikasa, led the Japanese line. As his fleet turned to cross the Russians' T, a classic naval maneuver that would allow his ships to fire full broadsides while the enemy could only fire their forward guns, Togo raised what would become one of history's most famous naval signals. The Empire's fate depends on this battle. Let every man do his utmost. What happened next was not so much a battle as it was an execution. The Japanese guns, pre-ranged and served by crews who had trained for this moment for years, opened fire at exactly 14,000 yards. Their first salvos struck with devastating accuracy. Russian ships, caught in a terrible position and with crews suffering from the effects of their 8-month journey, could barely respond. Here's a detail that perfectly illustrates the difference between the two fleets. Japanese gunners used a new type of shell filled with Shimose powder, a high explosive far more powerful than anything the Russians had. When these shells struck Russian ships, they didn't just penetrate, they devastated. Eyewitnesses described Russian battleships literally being torn apart by these explosions. But it wasn't just superior technology that won the day. The Japanese had another advantage: wireless communication. While this might seem basic by today's standards, in 1905 it was cutting-edge military technology. The Japanese fleet coordinated its movements with a precision that the Russians could only dream of. The battle continued into the night, where the Japanese destroyer flotillas took over. Like wolves hunting in the dark, they struck at the confused and scattered Russian ships. The Russians, their formations broken and their morale shattered, fired at shadows and sometimes at each other. By dawn the next day, the pride of the Russian Navy lay at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait, or in Japanese hands. The numbers tell the story. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 captured, 6 disarmed in neutral ports, and only 4 escaped to Vladivostok. The Japanese lost just 3 torpedo boats. In terms of human cost, over 4,000 Russian sailors died, while Japan lost only 117 men. It was the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, and in many ways, even more complete. The impact of this victory reverberated around the world. In Washington, President Theodore Roosevelt was stunned by the completeness of the Japanese triumph. He had been watching the war closely, seeing an opportunity to establish himself as a global peacemaker. Now, with Russia humiliated and Japan triumphant but financially exhausted, he saw his chance. The battle had profound effects on both nations. For Russia, it was the beginning of the end for the Tsarist regime. The humiliating defeat, combined with the costs of the war, sparked the 1905 revolution, a preview of the greater upheaval that would come in 1917. Russian sailors, many of whom would survive the battle only to be interned in Japanese camps, returned home with stories of how they had been treated humanely by their captors, sowing seeds of doubt about their own government's propaganda. For Japan, the victory was both triumph and burden. Yes, they had proven themselves the equal of any Western power. Their navy had accomplished what many thought impossible. But the cost of the war had nearly bankrupted the nation. More importantly, the victory perhaps taught the wrong lesson, that military might was the key to international respect and influence. American newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Here was a nation that had gone from feudal isolation to defeating a European superpower in just 50 years. The Yankees of the East, they called the Japanese, seeing parallels with America's own rapid rise to power. Editorial cartoons showed a small samurai warrior standing triumphant over a fallen Russian bear. In the summer of 1905, Portsmouth, New Hampshire became the unlikely stage for one of history's most dramatic peace negotiations. President Theodore Roosevelt, seeking to cement America's role as a global mediator, had invited delegations from both Japan and Russia to American soil. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, with its grand Victorian buildings and peaceful New England setting, would host talks that would reshape the balance of power in Asia. The Japanese delegation arrived first, led by Foreign Minister Jutaro Komura. Despite their military triumph, they were under immense pressure. Japan's economy was stretched to the breaking point, with foreign loans funding nearly 80% of their war effort. They needed peace almost as badly as they had needed victory. The Russians, represented by the skilled diplomat Sergei Witte, arrived with a different kind of pressure. The Tsar's empire was in turmoil, with revolutionary unrest spreading through its cities. Yet Witte played his hand masterfully, understanding something crucial about Japan's position. They couldn't afford to continue the war any longer than Russia could. What followed was a masterclass in diplomatic brinkmanship. Roosevelt, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, shuttled between the two parties, cajoling, pressuring, and occasionally threatening both sides. The Japanese public, drunk on victory, expected huge territorial gains and massive war reparations. The Russian public, despite their defeats, would not accept any peace that seemed like total surrender. The final treaty, signed on September 5, 1905, reflected this complex reality. Japan gained control of Korea, which would become its colony until 1945, the South Manchurian Railway, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. But they didn't receive the massive war reparations they'd hoped for. When news of the treaty terms reached Tokyo, riots broke out. The Japanese public felt cheated of the fruits of their victory. This sense of being denied their due place would have far-reaching consequences. In the decades that followed, Japanese military leaders would repeatedly point to the Portsmouth Treaty as evidence that Western powers would never treat Japan as an equal. This resentment would help fuel the militarism that eventually led to Pearl Harbor. But in 1905, the immediate impact was clear. Japan had arrived as a world power. European nations, which had long viewed Asia as their colonial playground, now had to reckon with an Asian nation that could beat them at their own game. The British, already allied with Japan since 1902, saw their decision to partner with this rising power validated. Other colonial powers began to worry about their own Asian possessions. The ripples spread beyond Asia. In India, nationalist leaders took heart from Japan's victory. If one Asian nation could defeat a European power, why not others? In China, Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionaries studied Japan's rapid modernization as a model for their own country's transformation. Even in the Middle East, Ottoman intellectuals pointed to Japan as proof that modernization didn't require wholesale westernization. For America, the war's outcome presented both opportunities and warnings. The US had generally supported Japan during the conflict, seeing Russia as the greater threat to American interests in Asia, but some American observers, including Roosevelt himself, began to worry about the long-term implications of Japan's rise. Their concerns weren't unfounded. Within decades, Japan would move from being the underdog champion of Asia to an imperial power in its own right. The same military excellence that had won the Battle of Tsushima would be turned against Western powers in World War II. The humble torpedo boats that had struck at Port Arthur would evolve into the carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor. Yet the Russo-Japanese War offers lessons that resonate even today. It showed how technological advancement and national determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It demonstrated that military power alone doesn't guarantee victory. Factors like morale, training, and strategic thinking often matter more than pure numbers. Perhaps most importantly, it revealed how quickly the global balance of power can shift. Russia's defeat marked the first time in modern history that an Asian power had defeated a European empire. It shattered the myth of Western military invincibility and began the long process of unwinding the colonial order. Today, as we watch new powers rise and old ones adapt, the events of 1904-1905 remind us that history's course can change dramatically in a single battle, that underestimating a determined opponent is always dangerous, and that every nation's moment on the world stage brings both opportunities and responsibilities. The waters of the Tsushima Strait have long since closed over the wreckage of the Russian fleet, but the echoes of those guns still resound in our modern world, reminding us that the tides of history, like those of the ocean, are ever-changing and often unpredictable. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of history's most pivotal conflicts. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating chapter of history, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have many more incredible stories from Japanese history coming soon. Also, let us know in the comments what other aspects of Japanese history you'd like us to cover in future videos.